It's very much my pleasure to welcome here today Dr. Erin Leif from Monash University and Dr. Amanda Gigliotti from University of Wollongong. So sit back, everyone, enjoy, and more instructions will follow at the end. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you, Rebecca. And Ethan, can we just toggle to my PowerPoint presentation? So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your afternoon with us here today. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the Gadigal people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting today. And also, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of the lands where I live and work in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Are you Gadigal people? People. Okay. Yes. And my lovely co-host today, Dr. Amanda, is from the University of Wollongong, which sits on the lands of the Wadi people. Wadi and Ilari people, yes. So we certainly pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here today. So let's get started because an hour goes by really, really fast. Make sure I can move everything. So what we're going to do today is a few different things, and I always like to start with a bit of an outline of the purpose and learning intentions for our workshop. And so our shared focus today is really on exploring institutional strategies for embedding universal design for learning, using the guiding principles of interdependence and collective learning. So when I talk about UDL, I sort of put people into three different buckets. I consider within my context to have UDL explorers, who are people who are very new to UDL, who haven't heard of it before, who are interested in learning more about how they might use UDL in their own teaching and learning practice. We have UDL actors, people who are actively starting to use UDL in their own practice, and finally UDL champions, or people who are starting to teach others about UDL and perhaps doing more systemic work across their own institutions to be able to embed UDL. So really what we're going to be focusing on today is how you can perhaps move from UDL actor to UDL champion, or how you can level up your game as a UDL champion within your institution to really focus on that systemic adoption. So we'll do this by looking at some of the enablers or systems level levers that we might be able to pull to start to embed UDL more systemically. And these are some levers or some enablers that we've discovered through some recent research that we conducted, where we spoke with UDL champions across tertiary settings in Australia to identify what helps, what works, what have they done within their own context to support the systemic adoption of UDL. Then we'll talk about goal setting, getting started, and then we'll work together on developing a bit of an action plan for you to take back to your own context to help guide your next steps within your own context. And we'll have some time at the end for reflection, discussion, questions, but I'd really like to hear from you about what you're working on in your context and what you plan to bring back to help you really push for more systemic adoption of UDL. Okay, so I've already mentioned that we have some resources for the workshop today. These were sent out via email to everybody, but you also can scan this QR code if you'd like to go directly to the shared Google Drive folder where all of the resources are saved. Now, what I would encourage you to do is download them and save them locally on your own device, because in Google Drive, they're all set to viewer mode, not editor mode. So please take a moment, scan the QR code, and Kylie, maybe I'll have you just pop that link into the chat for our online attendees. And I'll just give you a quick moment. Now there are six different documents. You'll have our PowerPoint slide, as well as these slides in a Word document template. You'll have a list of example goals for embedding UDL in your own institution. You'll have a strategy mapping template and 2 strategy map worked examples, and we're going to look at those a little bit more closely today. So what actually is UDL? I think that as we begin to have conversations about embedding UDL in our tertiary education settings, it's really important for us to pause and consider what we actually mean when we say universal design for learning. I think it's really important to pause and develop a shared understanding and definition or description of UDL. And I think it's really important that we talk about UDL not as just a teaching strategy or a checklist or a list of accommodations, but rather as a proactive planning framework. UDL involves learning design, and it's learning design that asks us to anticipate variability of our learners and to design learning experiences that remove barriers to learning and participation from the start, before we go into our classrooms or online learning environments and start to engage with our students. So this means that we have to think beyond individual adjustments and instead build environments, build learning resources, build learning activities that are flexible, accessible, and inclusive by design, not by accident. Having a clear and shared definition of UDL at the whole of institution level is really important, and it's something we're working on at Monash University. When everyone, from teaching staff to senior leadership, understands what UDL is, what it looks like in practice, we can begin to align our policies, systems, and supports in a way that truly enables inclusive learning across the institution. I think one of the biggest barriers that we encounter when attempting to scale UDL is a lack of a shared understanding. And so we get resistance because people think that we're asking them to use a very narrow pedagogy or to use one type of teaching practice or strategy that conflicts with their worldview and their autonomy as an educator. So really positioning it not as one strategy or one pedagogy, but as an inclusive design framework that isn't prescriptive about the types of pedagogies and practices that educators use, but rather guides our inclusive thinking from the start can be really, really helpful. So why an institutional approach? When we talk about UDL in tertiary education, it's important that we think of it beyond an individual practice. And I think a lot of our efforts are currently focused on sort of building the capability of individual professional staff and academic staff to use UDL in practice. And that bottom-up approach is important. But we have to go beyond individual practice. And look at how UDL can be embedded and supported at every level of the institution. So a whole of institution approach means that UDL is not something just a few people are doing because they kind of like it. It becomes part of the culture, the systems and the structures that shape learning across the university or the tertiary setting. So there are a few key reasons why this really matters. First, doing so will promote a more consistent student experience. Students benefit when inclusive design is embedded across units, across faculties and departments, not just sort of luck of the draw of having one or two UDL-informed educators. Second, it can support sustainability and scalability. Individual efforts can only go so far. But when UDL is built into institutional policies, processes, and professional learning, it becomes something that can grow and endure over time. It's not reliant on one or two champions to kind of hold the flag and then falls apart when those people transition out of their roles, as they inevitably will, or maybe not. And finally, it fosters a culture of shared responsibility and leadership. UDL implementation isn't just the job of academic staff, nor is it just the job of professional staff. It requires collaboration across roles, from curriculum design to technology to student support services and disability services. And everyone has a part to play in removing barriers and creating this more equitable learning environment. So as we move forward today, we'll be thinking together about what a whole of institution implementation plan, or a just one thing to do to get started plan, could look like, and how we can keep moving towards making this vision a reality. So now I'll turn it over to Amanda.
Thank you, Erin. So as we think about scaling UDL across our institutions, it's important to recognise that this work is not something that individuals, teams, or a role alone can do by themselves. This is where the ideas or principles of interdependence and also collective learning come into play. So interdependence looks at and acknowledges the mutual reliance that exists among educators, leaders, professional staff, and students. So we all bring our own unique expertise, experience, perspectives, and levers of interest. And so when we work in a coordinated way, then that's when we're about to look at bringing about more meaningful and more impactful change. So for example, think about a lecturer. I'm so sorry, I'm really tall, so I'm trying to lean over. So for example, think about a lecturer who's looking at redesigning a unit of work using the principles of universal design for learning. They're more likely to be successful if they're supported by learning designers, accessibility staff, and also a university culture that really values inclusive practices. When we talk about collective learning, we're starting to really think about creating opportunities for individuals to come together across different roles and also different disciplines to be able to share their practices, to reflect on what's worked, and to also to create knowledge together. Okay, so when we think about this, we're starting to think about there is not really one prescriptive way or single way that we're suggesting to move forward with universal design for learning. We're more so talking about coming together and learning from one another in ways that allow us to be able to create sustainable change and also look at building our institutions' capacity over time. So when we're looking at approaching UDL, we're looking at approaching it in a collective endeavour. And by that, I mean that's anchored by things such as shared responsibility and also continuous improvement, where we move closer to creating inclusive learning systems that cater towards all of our students rather than just looking at supporting some of them.
I put too many clicks.
You put too many clicks there, Erin.
Go back. There you go.
Here we go. Okay. So this consideration invites us to reflect on the types of learning environments that we create, not just for our students, but also for ourselves. When we think about universal design for learning, at the core, we're really looking at the idea that learning is a shared and social practice. So when we create opportunities for people to come together, we're offering opportunities for them to be able to generate ideas, possibly to talk a little bit about some of their different perspectives, their different disciplines, and also their lived experiences, so that we can create experiences and opportunities that allow everyone to have an enriched understanding. So we're not just talking about teaching and designing, but we're also talking about how it is that we can learn from one another. This is where collaboration and collective learning is really critical. So whether it is that you're working in teams, whether that be teaching teams or faculty teams, we're looking at the idea of building communities of practice where you can come together, share the different practices that you've used, reflect on what it is that has or hasn't worked, maybe push each other as well and challenge each other to engage, but then also start to possibly persist with some of that work that comes with system changes as well. So in looking at this, there's also the idea of interdependence. And I know that Erin's mentioned this previously. I've also mentioned it in my previous slide, but really that's the idea that we're all connected. For example, the work that I do as an educator, that affects the experiences that my students, support staff, and also leadership has as well, and vice versa. Interdependence is all about encouraging the act of care, being caring. It's also acknowledging that learners are there to support one another, and that inclusion, that we view that more as a collective responsibility rather than it just being an individual responsibility. So when we embed this mindset into our work through policy, professional learning, possibly curriculum design, we're not just talking about scaling UDL. We're also shifting the culture of learning within our institutions as well.
All right. So before we start looking at our action plan, it can be helpful to look at what actually can support UDL adoption in practice. So we recently conducted, as I mentioned, a research project exploring the enablers and barriers to implementing UDL in tertiary settings across Australia. And this work involved listening to educators, learning designers, and leaders from a range of institutions, universities, and TAFEs to understand what can help or what hinders UDL from being embedded at scale. From this research, we identified the first 3 key areas that consistently enable UDL implementation: leadership and strategy, professional learning, and curriculum and pedagogy. So this first one here, leadership and strategy, plays a really foundational role. We found that UDL is more likely to take root when it is reflected in institutional policy, strategic plans, and leadership priorities. Visible commitment from senior leaders and clear alignment with broader equity and inclusion goals sends a powerful message that UDL matters and is supported at the highest levels. Second, professional learning is critical. Now we're coming more to a bottom-up approach. Staff need opportunities to build their knowledge and confidence to apply UDL. So this includes access to high-quality training, mentoring from experienced colleagues, and spaces where inclusive teaching practices can be shared and strengthened, such as communities of practice. And third, we saw the importance of curriculum and pedagogy. UDL becomes embedded when units and assessments are designed with flexibility and learner diversity in mind, and when educators build their fluency with proactively planning for multiple means of engagement, representation, and expression, and sharing worked examples and case studies of what this looks like and how this can be done can be a really powerful tool. So now I'll turn it back over to Amanda to describe the other areas.
Thank you, Erin. So our research also highlighted several additional enablers that can significantly strengthen UDL implementation at an institutional level. The first of these is student voice. So incorporating student voice, particularly the voices of those students with lived experiences of disabilities and diverse learning needs in mind, in course design helps ensure that learning experiences are inclusive right from the beginning. Our research also showed that when institutions were, thank you, Erin, that when institutions were active in seeking and also using student feedback, that they were more likely to embed inclusive teaching practices that were meaningful and responsive to student need. Next is culture and collaboration. And this is all about building a shared language around UDL and inclusive teaching practices to create better alignment across departments and faculties. What we saw that was really valued is when there was work that was happening across interdepartmental teams and also collaboration across roles. And what this did was this brought together teaching staff, support staff, and leaders who were able to drive collective change within their own institutions. And finally, thank you, Erin, and finally, monitoring progress. This was all about institutions tracking, reviewing, and refining their UDL practices over time. So as part of this, this also included a continuous feedback loop where they were able to identify persistent barriers and also think about continuous improvements that can happen to UDL policy and practices. So together, these initial enablers were able to create conditions that enabled UDL to thrive. So it's not just an individual initiative, but as part of an institutional culture of inclusiveness, responsiveness, and shared responsibility.
Sorry, now I'm just being micromanaging.
Thank you. Okay, so this slide is a reminder that when we talk about enablers for embedding UDL, so things such as leadership, professional learning, and student voice, that these are not siloed, standalone elements. Instead, they're interdependent and they work best when they're connected. So for example, let's look at strong leadership strategies. This is not just about setting different directions, but this is also about incentivizing collaboration. So encouraging staff to be able to share their practices and also to become part of communities of learning. Similarly, when we talk about monitoring and feedback, it's not just about the tracking process, but this can also help us with targeted professional learning so that it is responsive and timely. When we look at embedding student voice, and this is done in a meaningful way as part of the curriculum redesign process, then this also affords educators the opportunity to start thinking about what's working, what's not working, and then when they can embed more inclusive practices into their teaching. So rather than thinking of these enablers as a checklist, we instead encourage you to think about the synergies. So progress in one area can also unlock potential in another area. So when we talk about system level changes, we're starting to talk about being connected, being dynamic, and also this being grounded in relationships across our institutions. Thank you, Erin. I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, so next we are going to move into our first activity, which is goal setting. So what I want you to do first, and we'll do this individually, is take a few minutes and have a look at the example goals for embedding UDL document. So one of the documents is titled Example Goals for Embedding UDL. And Kylie, maybe you could put that link. I don't know if there is a link, never mind. Kylie, scrap that. That is in the Google Drive folder and also was emailed. It's organized around the 6 key enabler areas that we've just discussed. So these are smaller goals, bigger goals, maybe goals that align with your role, maybe goals that align with the role of somebody else that you work with. But have a look at these examples. They're designed to spark some ideas about how to get started with some institutional action. I'm just going to give you a minute to have a read and have a think. Now what I want you to do is develop a goal. Start to think about your goal. Think about your role, your context, and your sphere of influence. And what is one small thing that you can begin to do to start to play a role in embedding UDL more systemically in your institution? This might be something you're already considering or you're already doing, or something that emerges for you as you look through the examples. And don't worry if it's not perfect. This is a starting point and we'll build. So if you would like to do this discussing with a partner, a neighbor, someone that you're sitting with at your table, we'll give you a few minutes. For our online folks, I'll invite you for this activity to just think a bit individually about your own goal. And what we're going to do in a minute or two is open a Padlet, and we'll invite you to share what comes to mind for you as an initial goal. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few minutes just to have a think or have a chat with folks at your table about potentially setting a goal.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So now that you've had some time to reflect and write down your UDL goal, I would love for you to share that with the group. I know a couple of people have probably already started to do that. I saw a couple of people scanning the QR code, so that's fantastic. But if you haven't had a chance, if you could please now scan the QR code that we have up on the screen. And would like to use Padlet as a way to be able to collect and visually see everyone's goals. Once you've had the opportunity to record your goal, I encourage you to take a moment just to read through a couple of the other goals that have been shared by some of our colleagues in the room today. So to contribute, just please simply click on the Padlet link, add a new post, and briefly describe your goal. You're welcome to include your name if you'd like to. Whatever you feel comfortable doing is perfectly fine. So this collective board is also going to stay live after today's workshop, so you are welcome to revisit it at any time. I think we've got a hand up. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much.
All right, I'm just going to ask Ethan here to pull up our shared bulletin board.
Is anyone still scanning the QR code?
Oh, just kidding. Ethan, go back to the QR code, please. And we'll just wait a minute.
You're welcome. Thank you. I think that's everyone.
Wait, I see one more person has their camera. Okay, now we'll pull up the shared bulletin board. Oh, fabulous. All right. Look at this. Loving it. Great. So I see some ideas around incorporating student voice, some ideas around focusing on redesigning assessment. That's, I find, one of the most challenging places to apply UDL. Start to develop communities of practice, facilitate conversations with members of leadership, explore as a team and look at breaking down the implementation process. I really encourage people to explore something called the active implementation framework. If you're interested in implementation science, start to collaborate with folks from accessibility teams, work with students as partners. Fantastic. I'll give you another minute to just update any goals that you have, but I think it can be really helpful to get a sense of where people's collective priorities are. I think there's a theme emerging here around student voice and really wanting to incorporate students' lived experience, which I think is so important. Also working with leadership. So really understanding, you know, what role leadership has to play in championing UDL within the university or the tertiary setting. Yeah, professional learning, getting involved with creating professional learning for staff is really important. Communities of practice to bring people together from different disciplines and departments, all fantastic ideas. So this has been really great just to kind of see the diversity of ideas. What we'll do now is we'll keep the Padlet open. You're welcome to continue to put your ideas down, but now we're going to go back to the PowerPoint and move on to our next activity. So So now that you've identified your UDL goal, we're going to move into strategy mapping. So this activity is designed to help you take that goal and start to think systemically by mapping it against some of the enablers that we discussed earlier and identifying short and long-term practical strategies. Is this the right slide? No, hang on. Let me go back. There it is. And start to identify a few practical things to get started. And so what we're going to do now is look at a worked example where I have prepared a strategy map that I'm going to show you. So can I move? Sorry. There's lots of moving and resharing screens, but I'm going to show you an example of a strategy map that I created. And I've gone right for the big gun because my goal for this strategy map is to ensure that UDL is reflected in university inclusive teaching and learning policy. So I'm sort of going like right to the policy level for this goal that I'm going to be sharing with you. The other worked example that you have in the folder is around starting to establish a community of practice as another way that you might look at actioning your goal. So as you can see here on this strategy map example, my goal is to ensure that UDL is formally embedded in key university policies and strategic documents, such as learning and teaching frameworks, course approval templates, and inclusive education statements to promote consistency, sustainability, and shared responsibility. So now what I'm going to do you know if I can make this a little bit bigger? On touch screen. Sometimes at the bottom, there's like
The view where it says view at the top.
view,
Zoom.
Yeah. We'll make this just a little bigger. Okay. Next, what we're going to do is look at how we can map these enablers across the system. So enablers are things that are already present or that you could leverage as to support your goal. So I've ticked some of the things in each of these different enabler areas that I might leverage to start to create a plan to bring my goal to life. So in the area of leadership and strategy, one thing that I want to be able to leverage is that senior leaders within my institution support UDL. So some of the ways that I might work towards this, if I'm breaking it down into action items, are to review existing strategic documents that identify opportunities to include UDL. So where could this fit within existing documents? Request a meeting with the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Learning and Teaching to share evidence for UDL inclusion and to start to build a case for the why. Or to develop a position paper showing how UDL aligns with equity and digital transformation policies. Now, these are just examples of actions aligned to that enabler area that I could take to start to bring my goal to life. The next enabler area is related to professional learning. So one enabler that I could leverage is cross-functional collaboration. So here I might look at how can I collaborate with academic developers, diversity and inclusion staff, and policy writers to start to co-create inclusive policy recommendations. In the area of curriculum and pedagogy, perhaps I'll leverage enablers such as incorporating UDL in unit design, creating templates and examples, and looking at how student feedback can inform practice. And what I might do is gather examples from current UDL actors or champions who are using UDL in their practice to look at the impact that that's had. So start to collect some stories of impact or start to collect some examples of student voice to bring to the table. In the area of student voice, I might engage with the student representative body or an education officer to provide input. So I might actually bring together some student representatives to inform the direction that we go in. In the area of culture and collaboration, I'm going to develop that common shared language around UDL. So maybe leverage existing UDL communities or networks to build momentum, and maybe develop together a glossary of language related to UDL to start to build that shared understanding. Make sure our documents are using language consistently. And finally, in the area of monitoring progress, I might look at identifying barriers that we could address or that have been addressed. I might do this by identifying gaps in existing policy, do a bit of a gap analysis to see where staff report confusion or lack of support for inclusive learning design, and use this data as part of our advocacy efforts. Now, you don't necessarily need action items in all of these different areas. This is just an example to spark some ideas. But once we've sort of looked at what are some things we could do aligned to these enabler areas, then we can start to develop some shorter term and longer term strategies. So for example, my short term strategies could be to audit existing teaching and learning policies to identify where UDL is missing or could be strengthened, meet with senior leaders to present the case for UDL, or draft that short discussion paper on the why. Longer term, I might co-develop a revised teaching and learning policy with UDL principles embedded in partnership with other key players within the university, and advocate for UDL principles to be integrated into course approval templates and academic workload planning tools. I've identified some resources or partnerships that I may need to make this happen. So who are the players that I want to be collaborating with? And then finally, I'm thinking about, well, how do the ideas of interdependence and collective learning play into this? Well, in this context, interdependence means recognizing that UDL policy change requires collaboration between policy writers, curriculum designers, senior leadership, teaching staff, and students. So how can we build a working party that brings all these people together to have conversations about bringing this to life? And as part of collective learning, I think we really need to identify what UDL actually looks like on the ground. How can we gather and share success stories, invite feedback through consultations, and co-create language and examples for people who will use these policies? Now, again, like I said, this is us going kind of right to the big sort of end of the spectrum, which is policy change. But this is just an example of how you might use this template to develop your plan. So in the interest of time, we'll do a little bit of an activity to give you an opportunity to practice using the template. So Ethan, if I could get you to switch back to my PowerPoint slides. What I would like you to do now is open the document that was shared with you called Strategy Map Template, not worked example. You've already thought about your goal area. So now we're going to build on your goal area to look at filling out some of the other sections of the strategy map template. So the first thing that you might do is review those enabler areas and identify which enablers you might leverage and which actions you might take as your next step. And then think about developing your short-term and longer-term action plan. So we don't have a lot of time left, but I do want to give you about 5 minutes to start to have a look at this. It's certainly something you can take away from this workshop and spend more time on as a follow-up activity. But what I'll do is I'll give you about 5 minutes to have a go at this. And what I want to do is then bring us back together for some questions and discussion. So those of you in the room, please feel free to partner up or form a little group at your table if you wish, or work on this individually. I'll give you 5 minutes. Go. Those of you online, if you would like to go into a breakout group, please go ahead and put your hand up, or Kylie, if you could open a couple breakout rooms, that'll give you a chance to get into a breakout room. If you wish, you can also work on this individually if you wish. So it's up to you. Work on it individually, go in your breakout group. I will leave it with Kylie to help coordinate that online. We'll give you about 5 minutes. All right, let's come back together as a group. Marco. Thank you. Call for attention. Thanks everyone. Now I know that was not enough time, but we wanted to really use this as an opportunity to provide a worked example and a little bit of a taster of how you could start to develop your strategic plan or your strategy map. But absolutely, we encourage you to take these resources back to your own institutions and adapt them, use them, do what you want with them to help plan for your sort of systemic journey. What we will do now is open it up for a bit of discussion. Well, we have about 8 more minutes, but I'm really curious to hear from all of you. You might have questions. I probably won't have the answers because this stuff is hard, but does anyone have any reflections? Anything that really is sticking out to them as, you know, something you're excited about to go back and share within your institution, a goal that you're currently working on and what's working for you, success stories? No. This thing on. We have someone here.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say for the online participants as well, if they wanted to put things into the Slido, and we can address those
Yes,
as well.
go ahead and pop things in the
Okay,
Slido,
so-
and even you in the room, Slido code. All right, hand. Thank you for being brave.
I'm Kathy Snelling from South Australia, and thank you very much, Erin and Amanda, for a really interesting and very useful workshop. Because I think that's a good thing. Workshops should be working and taking stuff away.
Yeah,
So
that was our goal.
yeah, that's not my comment. That's just my opening line. What I feel is, though, that you're encouraging us to do, and I think this is what we're all on that journey of, that UDL shouldn't be a process. It should be a way of thinking.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like when we're learning to embed it or learning to use it, it feels a bit clunky and a bit forced. But hopefully you get to the stage of, if you're not doing it, it feels weird.
Yeah, totally.
So
Let's all get to that stage where if you're not doing UDL, it's weird. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And I completely agree. Allow it to be clunky and uncomfortable. It still is for me. And I've been doing it for about 7 years now. Next comment, question, reflection.
Hi, my name is Betsy Beam, and I'm an academic here at the University of Sydney. And I think the thing that really struck me is, I've been banding around UDL, what it is, what it means, and your definition of UDL as a proactive planning framework, I think, is probably one of the most useful definitions I've come across.
Well, thank you.
Because and I'm trying to sort of spread the word and encourage my colleagues to embed UDL practices into their teaching. And I'll be holding a roundtable to help them last minute to embed things in next term, right? So it's too late for assessments, but really, how can we think in terms of proactively planning for inclusion? What strategies or tools might we have that you can slip into a unit that's already pretty well set out to just start achieving movement towards more inclusive design?
Yeah. Look, I think that's a great point. I think the idea of having a clear shared definition or description of what UDL is a great place to start to work towards more systemic embedding and adoption. And I would say that positioning it as all the things you do before you even see your students. This is all the stuff you do in the planning phase before you even, interact with your students, before you're in the teaching, can empower people to kind of know where it sits in the cycle. And also, it's less maybe threatening because people don't feel like you're sort of telling them they can't use pedagogies and strategies and practices that they really value and they feel are sort of a part of their identity as an academic. Use those things, but use them in ways that break down barriers before you even I'm trying not to say set foot in the classroom because I feel like that's ableist. Before you even go into the learning environment.
Is it okay to add something as well? The other thing that I also want to mention is that it's not always about conquering it all. And I think starting small and building upon that as well can really show staff that this is achievable. I've been very fortunate enough to mentor over 100 academics now in technology enhanced learning. And they're always coming to me saying, Amanda, I just don't have the workload to be able to do all of this. So it's about chunking it into manageable steps and thinking about the things that are easy to be able to integrate now. And then what do we want to work towards in the future as well? Thank you.
Thank you both. I
Slide.
do have a question from
Yeah.
the Slido. So Ari Starr from Macquarie University. I'm doing my master's on UDL and neurodiversity in higher education. I really like your research and I was wondering if it has been published or where I can see more about your findings.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This paper that we are discussing today is actually, we're just about to submit it. We're going to submit it to the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice. It's an Australian open access journal. We will be happy to share it with ADCET once it is published, fingers crossed, and share it more widely. In the meantime, I recommend looking at, there's some really good books, I think, about embedding the principles of UDL in tertiary education settings. Cheryl I don't know how to pronounce her last name. But what we might do is after this workshop today, what I think Amanda and I were interested in doing is sort of taking some of the collective wisdom and some of the goals and some of the conversation and writing a bit of a blog or a follow-up piece that we can then have ADCET distribute to all the attendees of this event. And we'll include some supplemental research and readings in that blog for people who want more to explore.
Wonderful. Yes, we all want more. Thank you. One more question and then a comment, and then that's it from the Slido for now. How do you see the balance and integration of different sectors institutions, such as connecting students with both tertiary educational institutions and the private sector or business industry?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. I don't know that I've thought quite that systemically. I think if we can, and I think about this in my own work because I teach the next generation of educators who are probably going to go into schools and primary and secondary schools and work with kids with behavioral challenges. That's my discipline, is learning and behavior science. And these are kids who often get put in the too hard basket. And what I want to do through my own teaching at Monash is model the use of inclusive teaching strategies and how I interact with them, so that then when they go into their professional roles, they can start to use and emulate some of those inclusive teaching strategies in their professional work. So perhaps the best thing that we can do immediately is to model inclusive teaching in our own practice and empower our students to take that forward into their professional work. And then we'll have to think more about, well, how do we change, business culture and different disciplines, which I think is a much bigger conversation.
Thank you. This is a great comment from Anonymous, from an online participant. I just messaged my boss to warn them that I'm all fired up and already have a goal and loads of ideas. So keep fighting the good fight, everybody. This is just the beginning. There are a couple of more questions that have just come through in the Slido, and the Slido is going to remain open. So please keep posting your questions,
Yeah,
and perhaps we can address
prepare
them
some written
and
responses.
provide some.
Because I love having more work to do. It's my favorite.
Love
No,
it.
that's
Can't
great.
get enough. So I'd just like to thank both of you so much. What a wonderful workshop to get us all started for the symposium.